Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, this is the first opportunity I've had to take a call on the Employment Relations Film Production Amendment Bill. I'm sure that it won't be the last. And can I say, first of all, I am very pleased that The Hobbit is going to be filmed here in New Zealand. I'm absolutely delighted it's going to be filmed here in New Zealand. I think I first read the book. I'm probably one of the only members in the House that's actually read the book. There must be others. Well, that's good to hear. But I'm really concerned. I am very concerned about the National Party's approach to this piece of legislation, which is taking the George W. Bush approach to this legislation. You're either with us or you're with the enemy. You're either with us or you're with the enemy. No subtlety involved in all of that. And actually, that's a load of rubbish, an absolute load of rubbish. You know, Mr Chair, I went to the movies a few weeks ago, don't do it very often, and I went and saw the movie called Maiden Dagenham, and it was all about the woman at the Ford factory in London who went on strike and campaigned in order to be paid the same as the blokes did. They weren't very popular at the time either.
Paul Quinn.
I have listened carefully to the Speaker, and this particular debate is focused on the title clause, and at this stage he hasn't mentioned it once so far, Mr Chairman.
Point of order, Mr Chairman.
Speaking to the point of order, Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Chairman, it is of course possible on a debate on the clause to go right through a clause without actually mentioning it and still be relevant the entire way. And I think when the member opposite gets a bit more experience, you'll understand that.
There are some sort of accepted norms about process. One is that a title debate is a very close debate, a tight debate. There is also another expectation when a bill hasn't been to a select committee. There is a slightly wider tolerance. So I wanted to stress this is not a general debate, and members, the Chair tends to show a little more tolerance about examples being brought in to the process of what the core, and we're debating Clause 1, which is the title. So, then I invite the member to convince me that's the case.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. 20 seconds and I am getting to the title. I think it's perfectly acceptable to make some preliminary remarks, because actually what I was talking about was, I'm going to come to an alternative title to the bill in a moment, because actually what I was talking about was the film Maiden Dagenham, the fact that the women who campaigned for equal pay for the blokes, they were pretty unpopular at the time. They kept on going, and ultimately they got what they wanted, and as a result, around the world now, governments have adapted equal pay legislation around the world. So that idea that it's the for us or against us, which we've heard from the National Party, because they may as well call this bill the you're for us, the Warner Brothers National Party, or you're against us. They may as well call the bill that, because effectively that's what they've come into this House and that's what they've argued. And, Mr Speaker, it's absolutely ridiculous, because I tell you what, the women who went on strike over in Dagenham, they weren't anti-car. They weren't anti-car by going on strike at the Ford factory, and the people who are opposed to this legislation aren't anti-Hobbit. In fact, I'm very keen to see the Hobbit filmed in New Zealand, and I'm delighted that that's what's going to happen. I'm very pro-Hobbit. We're very pro-Hobbit on this side of the House, very pro-Hobbit on this side of the House. So I support Mr Mallard's amendment to the Clause 1 of this bill, which suggests removing the words film production work and inserting the words as requested by Warner Brothers. As requested by Warner Brothers. This employment relations as requested by Warner Brothers amendment bill. Because when the Warner Brothers, they must have known from the minute they got off the plane and they were met by the VIP cars at the airport and swept away to Government House, they would have been rubbing their hands together and thinking, gosh, we better up the stakes a bit here. We were going in a bit low. We're going to go in a bit higher. We're going to demand more, because we know we've got the government over a barrel. They've sent these VIP cars out to the airport to meet us. They've sent these cars out to the airport to meet us. We can demand whatever we like now, because this government is just going to give us whatever we like. The government raised the cost of keeping the Hobbit in New Zealand. It was the government's mishandling of this issue that has raised the cost of keeping the Hobbit in New Zealand. That's why the House should agree to the amendment put forward by Trevor Mallard that that this should be called the, as requested by Warner Brothers, Employment Relations Amendment Bill, because that's why we're here. We're here because the government are basically doing whatever they're requested by a large multinational company who make millions, if not billions of dollars a year in profits, and the government are giving them a more taxpayer subsidy. They're giving them more taxpayer subsidy because they mishandled this issue from the very beginning, because they didn't have the relationship with Warner Brothers at the very beginning, and they only came into this late in the piece after it looked like the Warner Brothers studios were going to be pulling out of New Zealand altogether. So, Mr Chairman, the amendment put forward in the name of Trevor Mallard is in fact a perfectly reasonable amendment to the title clause of this bill. To the title, what is it again? It is to remove the words film production work from the title and change it as requested by Warner Brothers. Because that's, although Tauhenari's going to think about it. Tauhenari's going to think about it. He's in charge. He's in charge of everything. With all the bitter, twisted resentmentness that he's got over there on the National Party backbenches, it's good to know that he's still kept his sense of perspective, and he's going to be considering the amendment put forward by Trevor Mallard. It's interesting. He is in the National Party these days. It's hard to keep track, Mr Chair.
I'll give Chris Hipkins a second.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I was just getting warmed up because, Mr Chair, the critical point here in the debate on the title clause is what the appropriate title for this bill should really be. And I'm not convinced in any way, shape or form that the title suggested, film production work, should in any way, shape or form reflects what the true intent behind this bill is actually all about. Because I think John Key, when this all blew up about 2 weeks ago, wasn't it? About 2 weeks ago, John Key's actually, I'll give him this, he's a very, very clever politician. He's a very clever politician, and he thought, how can I do something that I wouldn't normally get away with? How can I turn this situation into something that's going to allow me to push some legislation through that would normally not gain public support? And that's why they came up with this amendment bill. I reckon the government went into the negotiations with Warner Brothers thinking, let's use this as an excuse to push through some legislation that we wouldn't normally get away with. And what did we hear from Heather Roy before? Heather Roy let slip. She revealed the true government agenda, the true National Party agenda behind this. They don't want this to only apply to the film production industry, which is why this title is misleading, Mr Chair, because we're going to be back here in a matter of months, I suspect, and we're going to be debating extending this provision to every worker in the country, just like they did with the 90-day legislation, which started out as a trial period. It was only going to be a small number of people. And what do you know? Within months, because the ACT Party told them to, they came back here and they're pushing through further changes to extend that 90-day probation period to everybody. So the title of this bill, which is the Employment Relations Film Production Work Amendment Bill, actually is misleading, because we know that the true agenda is that they should just be honest about it and call it the Employment Relations Amendment Bill. They should remove those words, film production work, altogether, because we know that's not what they're aiming for here. What they want to do is set a precedent here so that they can come back in a few months' time and say, well, actually, we don't think film production workers should be treated any differently. We think this should apply to the entire workforce. And all of a sudden, all those people, quite vulnerable in some cases, who are going to be pushed out and pushed into contract work, lose all of their rights to bargain collectively. The cleaners, the caretakers, those types of people, they're suddenly going to find themselves being deemed as contractors, and they will lose a whole lot of their employment rights that they have fought so hard over many, many years to gain. So, Mr Chairman, the title of this bill is misleading. It is unfair, and it doesn't give New Zealanders a true glimpse of what the National Party's real agenda here is. Mr Chairman, I'm very supportive of having the Hobbit in New Zealand. I'm very supportive of having the Hobbit in New Zealand. And I absolutely reject the notion that by being opposed to a change to the Employment Relations Bill, that somehow we're anti-film or we're anti-the Hobbit. It's absolutely ridiculous. It is like saying that the women at the Ford factory who campaigned for equal rights were anti-car. It's like saying that the Labour Party, by arguing against giving Murray McCully sweeping veto powers over the Rugby World Cup, it says we're anti-World Cup or anti-New Zealand, as the National Party claimed yesterday.